afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us again for one of Childcare 360's pop-up executive webinar series. Today's series topic is Finding Your Way Through Conflict, Strategies to Help Early Childhood Educators, which I know that we all cannot use enough of. Today, we will be having Chris Amirault as well as Christine Snyder joining us. And as we get started here, let's jump through into our next page on our agenda. What we're doing is our welcome right now. And what I'd like to bring your attention to is we do use the functions on the toolbar. So first is, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature. Q&A feature is if you have any type of question, and I know that Christine and Chris have encouraged to ask questions. So please feel free to put those situations in. And since this is sort of a situational conversation, do not hesitate to ask situational type of questions. Might take us a little longer to read them if we can get to them. If not, I know that Christine and Chris will surely get back to you even after the webinar to address some of those issues. Further, we will be conducting one poll, so we'll be asking for you folks to respond. And then obviously there's a chat function. Chat function is good to know that if you have any logistics, we have our team who are working furiously in the back end of our webinar here to make sure everything goes great for an experience for you. And in doing that, though, if you have questions of them, or you have a question about something that we have spoken of that you'd like more information on, or some kind of contact, that's a great place to do it, is through the chat feature, which they are monitoring. Of course, if you are attending and you are seeking educational continuing ed certificates, you will receive that as part of this course. And let's move forward to what is next is going to be our housekeeping items before we get into the presentation. And then we'll go into the Q&As. But please stay to the very end, because both Christine and Chris have provided you with a special gift. And we'll go ahead and get started. So first on our housekeeping, we've talked about it a number of times, but we've had an amazing response, and that is for the IC360 ECE Healthy Advantage. This is one of the few solutions outside of our membership that we do bring to members and non-members. And as you can see on the left of your screen here, that it addresses a lot of different flexible options as well as the type of benefits it covers. It is a very affordable plan. We spent the past 2 years going out and sourcing the kind of programs as well as the support to create this. So for an individual staff member or teacher looking for any kind of affordable plan, it is fantastic for the recruitment and retainment of staff. $11.50 is on the low end per week that they would pay for this plan, up to a full-blown program for their staff of $90. But what it does is it gives them a lot of different benefits right from $1. But for you as owner operators, the first 10 employees is $50 per employee. That's it, limited. Everybody after that is $25 per employee. So it really allows you to budget. It's very flexible for the staff members too, because there's 5 program options, all the way from a telemed program to the ultimate package, which would include $15 office visits, specialist visits at $15, urgent care, medications, all those different things that allows you to build it up. And you can pair that with some voluntary programs, as you see at the bottom left side of the screen here, that really make a lot of sense and flexibility for everybody. It's very easy to implement. With a lot of programs, it's very difficult because you have to be the administrator. You're the one who has to enroll people. You're the one who has to get all the paperwork back to the providers or the brokers and then over to payroll. With IC360 ECE Healthy Advantage, we do that for you. We are the benefit liaison. We support with the enrollment. We give the education. We also collect the enrollment. We make sure that it's all put together, give access to an online app, as well as making sure that your payroll knows everything about it. And it is compliant, especially with the new administration coming in and the new energy that's being put behind the Affordable Care Act. You can be assured that meeting your affordable care requirements is going to be critical. And this meets Part A, which we say is the expensive one of your Affordable Care Act. That is where if you do not offer a compliant plan, you would have a penalty for all the employees that you have. Part B is something that everybody has to pay for either way. If you were just a small school one-off or you were Bank of America, that's if someone went to your local state exchange, you would have to do a reimbursement if it was requested. But note that it does need some runway from 1.5 months all the way up to 2 months to get started. We've already had 30 ECE companies join. We actually now have a waiting list to get started because we've had so many people join this program. It's a fantastic program. The waiting list is to just ensure that we're launching it properly. So if you are interested and want to learn more, be sure to reach out to us, reach out through the chat function, or reach out directly here. Now, what I do want to make sure that you all know is that we have relaunched our Inspire University. So membership does have its privileges for our members, and that is that IC360 Inspire University, or we call it Inspire U, is a wonderful program. It is a content and learning delivery engine. This allows you to deliver all of your content, all of your learning on an ongoing basis to allow you to track it, certificates, produce them, manage them. We also have populated already with over 60 hours of professional development. In addition to that would be like handbooks and your new hire orientations and all your operational procedures. And we will have up to 100 plus courses in there by the end of 2021, so by the end of this year. This is for all of your staff, and there's unlimited usage for this for your staff that are registered in your schools. You also have the opportunity to build your own courses in Inspire University at no additional cost with our Inspire You Build course maker tool. And you can also publish any kind of videos or audios, PDFs, PowerPoint presentations, things of that nature are easily publishable and distributable. And so this is a fantastic way that when you are part of your membership with Inspire Care 360 is to get your courses across to brand new people who join. And we know that there is opportunity to always hire new people. So it has a survey engine included with it, and that means that you're going to be able to do surveys for your staff as well as your families as needed on an on-demand basis, depending on whatever you want to have, and it's highly accessible. So that means your team and even families can have access to it from their homes, or they can do it right from your school. It's available over smartphones. It actually works better over a smartphone device that it even does on a laptop at times. The content is really built for smart devices and tablets and what have you. Going on to the last item, a lot of you have seen these gentlemen before with Dan and John, but we are doing and incepting a new webinar series. So mark your calendars. We will be sending Outlook invites for all of you. There's going to be a 9 series coming up on financial experts. So 9 webinars starting in March, which will go through the remainder of the year. It'll be once a month on a dedicated day, hopefully. There might be some kind of conflicts with that, but we'll make sure that we have it well in advance for you. We're going to be addressing many key financial items for your business, including your key performance indicators like payroll, or looking at the cost of supplies, or looking at the different issues that you may have of variable costs in your business. If you're interested in acquisition, what does it look like? If you're interested in succession, if you eventually want to build your business to sell your business, as well as looking at many things around the CARES Act, PPP grants, and much, much more. Anything associated that comes out from the government. And we know that a $1.5 trillion package was just passed. So we definitely know there's going to be a lot more fodder of information for us to talk about. And with that said, we're going to move forward and move into our program of finding your way through conflict. So if I can ask for Christine and Chris to start popping on and joining us. I want to introduce Christine first. Christine is a co-author of How to Manage Your Conflict. She has over 20 years of experience within our ECE field. And so she, along with Chris, both deal with a lot of the same issues that you and I deal with every single day. She's the current director at the University of Michigan Healthcare System Childcare or Children's Center. And Chris is also the co-author of How to Manage Conflict, 30 years of experience in the education field, current director at the Tulsa Childcare Incorporated. So with that said, Christine, how are you doing today? Let's make sure we have your audio on too.
We're good. I'm good.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Wonderful. No problem. Wonderful to have you folks here. I know just a couple minutes right before we got started, we talked about, hey, do we want to throw a poll up there? And would it be okay if I shared the poll with everybody?
Yes, please.
Awesome. So we're going to launch a poll, and Chris, why don't you describe this poll?
Well, one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is that we like to think that our brains are stable and don't change in conflict, but we've learned through our research and work that actually our brains get flooded with feelings, and the feelings that flood our brains have a big impact on how we handle conflict. So we wanted to start with the feelings question. So up on the screen, you should see a poll that asks you how you feel. The first is that I get scared. Some folks get angry when they're in conflict. We often hear people tell us, oh, there's no conflict in my school. So if that's something that you think, you can choose that one, even though Christine and I don't believe you. Anxious, a lot of people get anxious in conflict. I'm certainly somebody who can get anxious in conflict. We also actually believe that you can feel hopeful in conflict, or even confident or relieved that the conflict has actually happened. So choose the ones that you, or the one that you think is most typical of how conflict makes you feel. Anthony,
Wonderful.
Which one would you choose? I'm very curious.
You know, it all depends on the type of conflict. Thank you for the question, by the way. Honestly, I feel that I do get anxious at times myself when there is conflict, but it all depends the type of conflict. If there's conflict between individuals where it seems to be out of my control, I tend to get more anxious. When it's within my control, I tend to have a little more confidence, just because I've worked an awful lot in this field too. So I appreciate the question, and let me end the poll, and I'm going to make sure everybody can see the results. And look at that, Chris and Christine, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, Chris, you may have led people a little to avoid the no conflict in my school, but I think it's not really a surprise that 69% of people feel anxious. I think that's certainly an emotion that comes up for me. And there's a pretty reasonable range of, positive feelings too, feeling hopeful or confident or relieved. So what are your thoughts, Chris? What would you say?
I am very happy to see the spread. I think it's interesting that there were folks who chose some of those positive ones we added. You know, Anthony, your response about control is something we talk about a lot in the book, and that it's actually a really important skill, especially for leaders, I think, to have, which is to know what's in your control and what isn't. And it makes sense that we're do-gooders, right? We, as they say in motivational interviewing, we all have righting reflexes. We want to make things right. And so when we're dealing with a situation that's out of our control, very often that can be a lot harder. And so that's a good one to know that you tend to do, and it's a good one to know some tricks for, which is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, no, and it's great. Before we get started, the way I like to relate conflict to in a way is sort of when you're flying in a plane. You oftentimes talk about to pilots, and pilots are like, well, they're not scared about turbulence at all. But we're in the back and we're being bounced around the place all over, and we're like, all of a sudden you get pretty anxious. It's because you're out of control. They're in control. They're flying the plane. They know what's going on, so they feel a lot more about it. It's a lot like conflict. And with that said, I'm handing it over to you folks.
That's a great metaphor, Anthony. I think that's really useful. Well, why don't we go to the next slide? And that, I think sometimes it's pretty obvious why we're talking about conflict, but as Anthony was doing his presentation at the front, I was thinking about these three items. Both Christine and I have been school directors for a long time. We really love it. We love that we have strange days every day, especially in the last 12 months or so. But one of the things that we've learned as leaders is that conflict is actually an essential part of our job. And we break it into 3 different parts. One is that more and more the research is pointing to the fact that if we're going to work with children under the age of 5 or maybe even 8, the connection between adult conflict and child conflict is very, very clear. So adults that are struggling with conflict in their classroom, they're very likely to see non-compliant behaviors and other sorts of problems with their children because the children don't feel safe. Children who don't feel safe in their attachments to adults, they're going to act those things out in their relationship to their peers. That's true for staff, and it's true for families as well. That parallel implications of conflict are very powerful. You know, Anthony, when you were talking, I was thinking most of the folks on this call want to retain their workers. And, you know, that's a really hard thing to do in early childhood. If we look at our field, we're probably not going to triple people's salary, which is too bad. I wish we could. That's what we should be paying everybody. But when you look at the reasons why people leave the field, almost always they talk about climate and culture, which is to say there's a component of workplace quality built into all of this work on conflict. And good leaders are working with their staffs to help them develop those skills, because that's going to help retain those folks that you want to keep. And then finally, Christine and I are really blessed to run programs that look a lot like the communities we serve. And it's great to have a diverse group of folks that are serving a diverse group of kids. But of course, diversity brings diversity, and that's diversity of opinion, diversity of perspective, and that often leads to conflict. That's why we like to say conflict is an opportunity to bring folks together. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but with our tips, we really are feeling like that's a great way to approach conflict. I don't know,
Well,
Chris, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, actually, I was going to jump in for just 1 second, if that was all right. I'm so happy to hear you say about, you know, culture and climate. You know, one of our big things, one of our big mantras at IC360 is we're very philosophically based in the fact of not just being solutions, but really getting to amazing culture is really the secret sauce, you know, our secret sauce in our business, in our schools. Because once you have a culture, culture means a lot about belonging. And conflict oftentimes is sort of that push, that natural push to push people away from belonging. So I would also be interested in Christine's thought on that too.
I agree with both things. I think, you know, when we get to talking about some principles of conflict, the biggest thing we've come to realize is that it is the work. We can't get to anything else if we aren't spending time on how to approach and navigate through conflict. So it absolutely is central to creating a successful and positive environment for everyone. It impacts the staff, it impacts the children, it impacts the families, the community. So it is the work.
Awesome.
So we're going to talk quickly about the 6 core principles, and actually Christine just said one of them out loud. Sometimes they sound obvious, but in conflict, as we'll discuss, your brain often loses things that are obvious when you're not in conflict. We'll do a few scenarios. I think that there's a great opportunity to look at conflict when it's particular, because when you look at particular situations, you learn a lot about who you are in conflict and what other perspectives you're blocking out. Then we'll talk about attitudes. We all know that for adults to learn, they need the knowledge, the content, they need the skills to be able to apply the content, but they also need a mindset. They need an attitude to feel like this is the way to move forward, to grow, a growth mindset. And so we've identified 4 essential attitudes in conflict that we're going to share with you. And then finally, as you'll see, we don't get to the concrete steps until the end, and that's because there's a lot of preliminary work that needs to take place before you dive in to that tough conversation. So we'll talk quickly about that at the end.
Awesome.
Christine, I think you're going to take the principles, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. So oftentimes we think about conflict being something that is done for us or to us, but it's actually really with us. So Tony, if you want to advance to the next slide, rather than thinking about conflict as something happening to us or for us, or sometimes staff want leaders to kind of solve things for them. But we actually need to start with ourselves, thinking about our definitions of conflict. And Chris and I established these 6 core principles about conflict that can really help us establish some framing for thinking about it, but also could explore what we're contributing to or thinking about conflict. And the first is that conflict is natural, normal, and deeply human. And this is honestly the one that I have to repeat to myself the most often, that sometimes when I get into conflict, it makes me feel kind of ashamed, or that I'm inadequate, or that there must be something wrong with me if I'm contributing to tension, whether it's in my relationship in my home or if it's in my work. But really, conflict is just part of being a social human, that by spending time with other people, we are sometimes going to get into conflict. And it doesn't have to be toxic. Actually, avoiding conflict tends to create toxicity in environments. But when we learn how to approach and engage in conflict, it actually can be really healthy and really relationship building.
Christine, can I just add one quick note to that? As you know, in the last couple of weeks, both you and I have had new conflicts, because that's what always happens, even when you've taken years to study something and written a book about it. And I think that that sense that you somehow screwed up because you're in conflict, folks, we are not experts, and we'll say that a lot. It's a natural, normal part of our lives too, even though we've spent so much time trying to develop those skills and understanding.
Certainly, I think the difference, Chris and I, we should say that we've spent 5 years developing this work together. We've facilitated this content around the country with groups up to 400 or 500 people, and we've done really small group focus conversations. We've used this work in a variety of ways in addition to publishing this book. And we have realized that we never get perfect at conflict, but I think Chris and I do have a very strong commitment to engaging in and working through conflict. And I think that's really what the goal is not establishing perfection and never getting in conflict. It's really just about committing to the process and getting a little more comfortable being in it.
Hey, Christine, let me ask you, with my schools, I have noticed, for the 10 plus years that I've owned and operated them, that there are some people who can deal with conflict in the schools, but there's also more than their fair share, I would say, in our industry of people who really want to avoid conflict. And they use many different, tools or methods or just, behaviors, I would say too. From your experience, what really got you and Chris involved to get to this point? Because you're both coming out of really the ECE and the education field, and you're like, we really need to address conflict. So what brought you to this point?
So there's actually a moment in time in mine and Chris's work and friendship together where this happened. And we met serving on a national board for NAEYC. And we were just in conversation talking about really, I think, the sessions we were facilitating at the conference that year. And he does a lot of professional development with educators and has taught at multiple higher ed institutions, which I have also. And I was at the time doing a session on resolving conflicts with toddlers. And we just had this moment that we were like, wait, we're asking teachers to do something we don't help them do, that we don't spend time in higher ed courses or even enough time in professional development helping develop our ability to resolve conflicts. But then we expect teachers to turn around and do that with children. It's like asking someone to, teach a child to play the piano. If you don't play the piano, you're not going to be successful with that. So we just started to realize that we needed to bridge that gap, that if we want teachers to be successful in supporting children's development of conflict, we needed to give them a ton of practice, recognizing how they show up to conflict, the reasons they show up to conflict that way, strategies for engaging in difficult conversations when it feels really difficult. And it really is about a commitment to time and a process, that this will never be something that it can be, a one and done kind of workshop, that it's commitment. And really the second principle, it's the work, that this is just going to be a central part of how we operate together as a school community and supporting a bunch of really important little people.
Awesome. Thank you.
So just to reiterate, that's the second one, that we really can't get around it, right? It is the work. We sometimes think conflict gets in the way of the work. I just want to teach children. I just want to do my job. Those are things that people often say. But part of the work is navigating our emotions, navigating our conflicts. And we connect this to the principles of co-regulation, that if we want children to be able to manage and process all of their emotions, even the big, ugly, uncomfortable ones, we have to get comfortable managing and processing our emotions, including the big, ugly, uncomfortable ones. And workplace conflict is often a source of those bigger, harder emotions.
So you guys said, hey, throw some things at you. I'm going to do that. I know you have a few scenarios coming up after this, and I'm hopefully not going to step on any of them. But from being, we have a lot of owner operators on here, so it's not as much teachers. And one of the things, though, that I think that a lot of us fear is when we have a toddler who's a biter. Okay. We've laid down the laws. We have a code of conduct. We've got a wonderful parent handbook. We've spent a lot of time in registration, but the child just keeps on biting. And our attempts of behavioral work with the child and speaking with the parents, whether the parents are disengaged, which we have probably about, a number of times. How do you handle parents in a situation where you have to have a very difficult conversation to the point where you may have to even terminate the relationship with them eventually? When you think about that and the principles that you bring, you say that's, conflict is work. That is part of our role. So how do you take that on?
Christine, why did I take that? Just to add to the background conversation. So I've been doing work in equity and diversity for a number of years, and was one of the founding facilitators of the NAYC's Equity and Diversity Interest Forum. And that work way back when, one of the things we were paying attention to was the disproportionate number, and still paying attention to, the disproportionate number of children of color, specifically Black boys, who were finding their way into expulsion and things like that. And the National Black Child Development Institute did a really important study, which had to do with that co-regulation point that Christine was talking about. The reason why I bring this up is that biters are absolutely predictable. We know that in early childhood, that's going to be something that children will exhibit. It's something that particularly happens when children are dealing with speech issues, which could be muscular, they could be second language, there's all sorts of things like that. But one of the things that we try to stress in the book, and it's the next principle, is the conflict is almost always reciprocal. And so a child in a classroom who's biting, chances are pretty good that the teachers are feeling what that National Black Child Development Institute report suggested, which is that they're feeling the way you are, Anthony, when you're in conflict and you can't control it. They want to assert control. They feel like they're not good at their job. They're creating an environment that actually it creates opportunities for behaviors that are problematic, as opposed to feeling confident and supportive. That also tends to bleed into the relationship with family members. If in the back of your head, which is something you just said, Anthony, you're thinking, this might be a conversation we have to have that has an end. That if that's in the back of your head, you may be anticipating a conflict, which is really different from going into a conflict and thinking there's a way out, as opposed to we're leading to some clear end result, which is about somebody being terminated. All of those sorts of things, I think, feed into the moments between children and teachers, but also between administrators and teachers, and between administrators and parents. The exact scenario you described, we devote almost a whole chapter to in the book, which has to do with the times that I screwed that up. And it really had to do with not partnering with the families, not partnering with the teachers in a sort of growth mindset, solution-based approach that was about identifying strengths, as opposed to perpetuating a problem that was basically happening all over the place. And we were just focusing on one little kid biting. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Christine.
I think that's an excellent answer. I think those situations are always complex. I think my response, both in support of the classroom teachers, of the parents, of all the children involved, is always remembering to keep our conversations child focused on our shared commitment to supporting children, their development, their growth, and remembering that behaviors like biting, while they can be severe and they're very alarming to adults, they are modes of communication that really suggest an area that hasn't developed yet, whether that is communication or social emotional regulation. And we want to afford the same kind of brainstorming process, time commitment to supporting development in that area that we would for something like walking or handwriting or something like that. Certainly more complex and nuanced when there's a behavior like biting, but we want to look at what we understand about development and keep our conversation child focused. And we do often see teacher conflict come up around responding to challenging behaviors with children because it's stressful, it's uncomfortable with the parents, it's really, really complex, and goes back to our feelings. So whatever it was we identified in that beginning poll about how conflict makes us feel, whether it's anxious or angry, all of these things start to surface for adults that impact kind of how we navigate those really difficult child behavior situations.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Chris, do you want to move on with the next one too?
Sure. Well, we just mentioned conflict is almost always reciprocal, so I'll cover that one quickly. The reason why that's there, of course, is that very often in conflict, our brain is actually built to think that that other person is a moron and they don't understand, and what they're supposed to do is change their behavior. You might have noticed that that notion that the other person is a moron has been part of our culture in this country for the past few months. It's kind of all over the place. And so it's really important to take a deep breath and recognize, you know what, if you're in a conflict, you are in the conflict. You're contributing to it, you're part of it. And the way that you're in it the most is when you think you're not. And that's when people get caught up in the difference between intent and impact. We talk a lot about this, that sometimes you do things that you didn't intend would create conflict, but the impact on somebody else is conflictual. And having the ability to take a deep breath and sit down and look at the impact will help you work through those ruptures and repair them in a positive way. But you can't do that if you think the other person's the only one to blame. Similarly, conflict exists if someone says it does. Full stop. Period. This is, everyone wants to negotiate this when we have this conversation. Anthony, we're here to tell you, if someone says there's a conflict, there's a conflict. Now, the problem is that we don't all have the same definition of conflict. We spend the entire first chapter talking about that problem because you might define the conflict a certain way. And so you think, what's the big deal? And, you know, we see this a lot in early childhood by people saying, oh, that's not a big deal. Oh, that's not a conflict. And somebody else is thinking, well, come on now. I want to sit down and talk about it. And this is where Christine and I always go back to relationship building. Do I really want to have a positive relationship with Christine? And if I do, I need to honor the fact that she's saying we've got a problem here, right? Shrugging my shoulders and brushing it off, that's not going to make me feel like this is a good working relationship. Early childhood is very strange. We put people in rooms with little human beings for hours and hours and hours on end and keep our fingers crossed that they're going to get along. Well, that's a hard thing to do, especially if you feel like I'm not going to pay attention to what you think is important. So conflict exists if we says it does, if someone says it does, is a way to foreground that relationship that you want to work through. It's assuming that the goal here is collaboration in an ongoing way.
Well, you know, and Chris, you know, Dale Carnegie, I think one of his chapters, it's one of the middle chapters in the book of How to Win Friends and Influence People, say that, you know, oftentimes we lack coming to conversations about conflict without them having noble intent. And noble intent being is that we tend to think that because someone may either not agree or they have a different point of view, or they're going in a different direction than we are, that they're intentionally bringing conflict to our doorstep, where that most oftentimes is not really the case. They have a noble intent that they're trying to achieve some kind of goal or objective that isn't about going up against you, you know, according to, you know, in Dale Carnegie's book. But it is an interesting concept of what you were just talking about, of when someone says they have conflict, very well possible, but they may not be bringing it to you as they're having conflict with you.
You know, I think that's a great way to put something that Christine and I probably say less articulately than Dale Carnegie. I think noble intent is a great way to frame our assumption. Now, of course, sometimes you discover somebody doesn't have noble intent. That's an HR problem. That's a whole other situation. But if somebody's trying to figure stuff out and they're fumbling around, and, you know, we joke about this all the time. Chris is going to be Chris. Christine's going to be Christine. Anthony's going to be Anthony. We're going to show up like who we are. And we've all got pimples and should have brushed our teeth this morning. So if we accept the fact that we're imperfect and doing the best we can, chances are pretty good that noble intent is going to get us through most conflicts, which we find to be a huge relief. Like, what a great confidence builder. I know, Christine, what did you think about that reference to Dale Carnegie? I thought that was really interesting.
Well, I always just relate the intent and impact thing to a car accident. And so, if someone rear ends you and your car is now damaged and you get out and they say, I didn't mean to hit you. You're not like, you know what, you're right. My car's not totaled. You really didn't mean to. But on the flip side, you always want to defend your intent, right? You rear end someone and you're not like, oh my gosh, I ruined your day. You might be like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hit you. So we have a tendency to defend our intent. We don't have a tendency to see someone else's intent. So how we play around with intent and impact has a tremendous effect on what conflict looks like. But I agree that noble intent certainly goes a long way. We do pay attention to just generally how are people showing up to situations? Does it seem like they're being malicious, or does it seem like we're really trying our best? And sometimes we make mistakes. It goes back to that principle number one, that conflict is natural, normal, and deeply human. That if we have noble intent, we are also going to be humans who sometimes make mistakes and sometimes rear end other cars.
And Anthony, if I hear you correctly, noble intent is connected to that fifth principle too, right? Which is that if I'm going into a conflict trying to beat somebody up, then that's not noble intent, right? I'm not trying to advance a principle-based, values-based culture. I'm trying to get you deserve what's coming to you, and I'm going to be the one who gives it. And that's win, lose, right, wrong thinking. And that's how you sustain conflict. It never solves conflict. It sustains it. And it's sort of embedded in that turning away from those values and principles that make that strong culture you were mentioning.
Fantastic.
Chris, I had a story I wanted to share with you right here, because we've been doing these deep dive small group discussions on conflict. And in one of these discussions, we asked two pretty significant questions. And one is, what's important to you in conflict? And people usually say things like to be heard, to be valued, to be respected, to be treated fairly, or whatnot. And then the second question is, how do you know a conflict is resolved? And people usually say, we're making eye contact again. We have a solution that we're focusing on. It's calm, it's comfortable again, all these things. In neither of those questions, what's important to you in conflict, or how do you know when a conflict is resolved, does anyone say anything about winning? No one says it's important to me in conflict to win. And no one says, I know a conflict is resolved when I have won. And so even though sometimes we enter into conflict with this, like, I'm going to defend, I have this idea, I have this need, that's never actually what we identify as being important to us, and is never what people are looking for when they talk about what resolution looks like.
Awesome.
Anthony, did you want to jump in there? I thought you unmuted for a moment.
No, I didn't. I was just saying, thank you. That was awesome.
Oh, great. I just learned something from this conversation, Christine. So this is the perfect tee up for number 6. We're a little weird, right? Christine and I are a little strange. People get into conflict.
Join the party.
Putting our hands together. We think this is the coolest stuff in the world. And it's because we are completely convinced of the last thing. Every conflict has something to teach us. Every single one. And so Christine just said something that I have never thought of, and it's going to make the point about parallel process perfectly. When people in her program talked about resolving conflict, they said, we can make eye contact again. And every early childhood educator knows how important eye contact is. That is the foundation for attachment, not just for little tiny babies, but for humans too, that are a lot older than babies. But we bring our baby selves into conflict. I hate to break the news, but we go back often to our earlier experiences. And so that simple feeling of connection, that sense that I'm working with someone else, that's what people call repair in the world of mental health. The rupture and repair is what the goal is to treat the conflict as an opportunity to teach us more about ourselves individually, more about ourselves in a relationship, and to be able to move forward.
And repair is not about getting a trophy. That's not in the book, right?
No, but eye contact feels like a trophy.
Right. So Chris mentioned the importance of really defining and understanding conflict. And we have these 3 scenarios, and we actually have 5 that we have in the book that we present to help people think about their perspective in a given situation. What do you understand about this? What's your response to it? Do you want to engage in it? And then Chris, I'm thinking with the interest of time, maybe we should just pick one of those to explore. They're certainly available in the book, and potentially even in the the book study guide on the website. I don't recall. But do you want to pick one? Which one do you want to talk about?
Well, why don't we let Anthony pick? Anthony,
Ooh.
would you like the confrontation in the parking lot about a political bumper sticker, a disagreement about somebody removing artwork from a classroom wall, or a child who suddenly starts having tantrums?
So I'm going to lean towards the top two, mainly because we are often addressing from the IC360, even though the tantrum from the child is extremely important and there's a lot of focus. I'm looking at sort of the interpersonal professional side of conflict. And so that tends to either be the bumper sticker or the child center artwork. But you know what? Let's take the bumper sticker head on, because I think with all the social media that we see today, everything that's affected, you already made a mention to it, Chris, and I think it would be interesting to see how this plays out with how you're approaching.
Let's do it. Hey, we did the political bumper sticker. We did in the weeks after the national election with like 400 people. So like you picked it, man. That's the hot one. Let's do it. Go for it, Christine.
All right, so you pull into the parking lot at work. There's a car behind you. The driver is a parent from another classroom. They roll down their window and they begin berating you for a political bumper sticker on your car. And if you have access to your chat box, go ahead and just enter your thoughts here. And the question is this a conflict to you? You have a parent from another classroom berating you for something on your car. And we want you to think about, is this a conflict? Do you consider it a conflict? We also want you to think about, specifically what is the conflict and how comfortable you're engaging. So you can feel free to interject your responses in the chat box, but Chris and I will share some of the reflections from previous discussions that we've had about this. And oftentimes we get comments like, absolutely, that jerk, he shouldn't be yelling at me. Or we get things like, yeah, I don't really care. I don't know that person.
So while you guys are doing that, and we would encourage any of the participants to, just say yes, no, or, either way, what your thoughts are. The way I sort of see this is we see this bumper sticker, probably more than we ever have with social media. And I think it is very applicable because we're talking about interpersonal relationships. What we see more and more, and this is something that can, obviously occur face to face within the center, between families, between teachers, between administration. But there is sort of the idea of conflict without thinking through the results, where this conflict is going to lead to. So as people answer, Christine, I'd ask you, what are your thoughts on how people, when they have sort of a visceral reaction to a bumper sticker, they're having this visceral approach, and in turn, you find yourselves, in a situation where it's more of a defense mechanism than it is a prove you're right or wrong mechanism.
So a lot of this comes down to risk, and it actually goes both ways. So when, if let's say you're the driver that sees the bumper sticker that really, sets you off, you might feel like you could have a visceral reaction because you don't know that person. You're not going to see him again, zero risk. And kind of the same thing if you're on the receiving end, when if the person reacts to you and you're deciding if you want to engage in this conflict or not, you're not risking relationship with someone you don't know again, but you also don't know what they might have in their car or on their hip. And you might be risking something you don't even know about because that is a stranger. So sometimes people will decide like, yeah, I'll go there with this person. I'm not risking losing my relationship. Or no, I'm not going to go there with that person. I don't owe him anything. I'm never going to see him again. Or I don't know what's going on for that person. Am I going to get hurt if I do try and go there with a reaction? So a lot of it is a quick assessment about risk, about how and why we might engage and what we have to lose.
Christine, you ask a great question when we do this workshop, which is what happens when you change the gender or the height or the race or the style of car or the bumper or the license plate, right? If you change some components of that identity of the person who's yelling, does it increase or decrease the risk? Does it increase or decrease your sense of engagement? Does it make you think something is or is not a conflict? And again, of course, Thank you, Norma and Bob. There's no right answer to this question. The purpose of the question is actually to get you thinking about what is and what isn't a conflict from your and from others' perspective. You know, Anthony, I'm going to answer your earlier question too. One of the things we did a lot of research on in getting ready and writing the book had to do with the way our brains function in conflict. And there's a great phrase for what you just described, that reactive mode. It's called amygdala hijack. And it's when a part of your brain takes over. And when that part of your brain takes over, it's very, very hard to learn how to back off of reaction and try to engage a response. It's actually a very, very challenging thing to do, and it happens to everybody. So that's a part of the human part, right? Humans have these brains they carry around, and sometimes brains don't do what you want them to.
Now, one of the things that Christine said, as well as what you followed on with, which I think this is a good, discussion here, is oftentimes you have the bumper sticker in the parking lot or the social media where you don't know the person on the other end of it. And as Norma had mentioned, this definitely can be conflict because there could be a safety issue associated with it, as Christine implied about it. But when we see conflict in a school where you have two teachers who are going at it, or you have you're getting pushback maybe from a staff member when you're hoping for it, what type of tools in a leadership role do you sort of coalesce around, come around as trying to resolve and diffuse that conflict? Something of this nature where it may be a reaction, it might be something visceral, or I can't remember the phrase you just called it, but what kind of tools can a leader likely start working through to manage through these?
Christine, I suggest we go to the attitude slide because I think that's a great way to kind of lean into where we're headed. Do you want to answer that, or shall I dive in?
Go ahead and make your transition to attitudes, and I'll chime in with my thoughts after you touch base on that.
So, Anthony, I'm going to go back to something that you said. I mean, your name is Inspire Care, right? That's the name of the organization. There's clearly a commitment to a caring culture, to creating a values-based culture. And Christine and I are very big on naming those values and living by them and bringing them up a lot. We both use the NAYC Code of Ethics in our work. We both have community-based values that we name. And we came up with 4 attitudes because they're connected to that mindset. Those folks who are in the battle royale that goes on and on and on, it sounds like they're not committed to some of these attitudes. So why don't we take a look at those 4 attitudes? The first one is that you have to be able to non-judgmentally reflect on what's going on. And that's really hard. You got to be able to step back and actually reflect on what's that other's thinking? What am I thinking? What's happening here? This is one of those key things in early childhood that we use all the time for assessment. We want to have the opportunity to reflect on something without trying to diagnose kids or put kids in this box or that box. And that's connected to the attitude of humble curiosity. One of the questions that I use all the time in my leadership team meetings, actually I used it yesterday in the middle of an ice storm. It was the question, what are we thinking of? What aren't we taking into account? What perspectives are we missing? And that's not a gotcha. It's not a rhetorical question. It's because it's actually really interesting to stop and think about what you don't know. And in conflict, I guarantee there are lots of things that you don't know about what's happening. The third thing, as you probably can tell, Christine and I really believe that humor isn't simply something that is character driven. You need to have a sense of self-effacing humor because yourself is going to get you into trouble. Christine is going to Chris it. And when she does, she's going to step in it. She's not going to do it right all the time. And Chris is going to Chris it, and he's going to make mistake after mistake after mistake. And he's got to be able to look at the Chris that he brought to the prom, because that's who he's going home with too. And so you have to be able to look at those things with a sense of humor about yourself and chip away at that self with a sense of humbleness. That's really important. And then the final one is something Christine said already. A lot of people are troubled by imperfection. They feel like a small mistake proves that they are not worthy, that they're not truly sacred human beings, and that imperfection is the proof of that. And so learning how to accept those 4 attitudes at a leadership level, naming them explicitly, that's the foundation upon which we build the 12 steps, because we've got a 12-step thing coming. But the foundational piece is mindset. If a leader is running around tearing people new ones, yelling at people in the hallway for making mistakes, calling people out, it doesn't matter what the steps are. If you do not have these sorts of things embedded in your culture, you're going to perpetuate conflict. And unfortunately, that's what we see so often. Teams will come in, and if they have their supervisor with them, it's a very different engagement than if that supervisor isn't there. And of course, they chose to come to a session about conflict, so it's clearly something on their minds. I don't know, Christine, you want to add to those?
Yeah, of course I do. I always have something to say. I think it's important. I just want to reiterate that we have shared language around our commitment to the work. We use the NACCE Code of Ethical Conduct. When I took this position at my current center, that's what we started with. We needed a shared commitment of how we were going to treat each other. It gives us some language to come back to. I also think that we always need to keep things child-centered, that anytime we have a conflict, we can always say, what is the impact on children? When we're screaming and swearing at each other in the classroom, how does that impact the professional commitment we have to the environment for children? What are they learning, whatnot? I also think that, Chris and I always say small conflicts almost always become big conflicts if they're unaddressed. You can't keep sweeping sand under a rug and not expect to get an anthill. So we want to make sure that we're addressing those little things. And the more we practice conflict with the little stuff, the easier the big stuff is. So a lot of times when we see these big blowups, it's the avoidance of the work along the way. So part of that is just doing the work. Every time little things come up, we have to put some energy into it. And that's really to kind of mitigate the long-term big blow up kind of things that happen. And then the other thing is just to accept mistakes. Going back to that first principle and this last attitude, we're human. We are absolutely going to be imperfect in this. And those aren't signs of failure. That's just signs of humanness and a need to re-engage in the work. But we also have some very specific steps, which are on the next slide. And this really is a bit of a teaser for some deeper content in the book. We have a chapter on each of these steps, but basically we identify 3 steps that are broken down into specific action components. And the first is really focusing on yourself, doing your individual work. And that is establishing your perspective and making sure you're prepared to describe what's happening for you and recognizing what you have at stake, what is grounded in your identity. And this part's really important. In order for you to communicate your needs and hear the needs of someone else's, you need to spend some time on you.
And also, Christine, I want to step in and reference what Norma said about risk, right? About feeling safe. That a lot of times conflict is connected to situations in which somebody feels threatened. And that's a very different situation that we're having an argument over who put what on the wall. So it's important for you to really explore that, ideally with a supervisor, ideally with somebody who has some HR experience. And if you don't have those folks, you need a squad. You need your people to be able to talk through that stuff with you, because these are real issues. These are not small matters. You want to do step 2, or should I do step 2?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, step 2. Step 2 is you and the other person broke trust. That's why you're in a conflict, right? If you trusted each other, you could fix it in 15 seconds. But when you don't trust each other, everything else gets in the way. You stop making eye contact, to use that thing I mentioned before. So it's really good to take the logistics seriously and collaborate on them. And Anthony, since I know that most of these folks are director owners, I want to point out that this is where we go back to, this is the work, not getting away from the work. Unfortunately, we live in a ratio-driven world and people need to be in rooms with kids. But it's really important as supervisors that we create opportunities for the 2 people to go through the logistics of what are we going to talk about? How are we going to do it? Where can we do it? There's a lot of little pieces that are actually really, really important. And as you go through those little pieces, what Christine and I have found is you start to see that other person as more than the conflict. You're working together. You're figuring stuff out. You're actually collaborating. Even though it's not about the big piece, you're still working together. And again, we're taking a relationship forward approach to this. Doing that is building back the relationship. And you better do a little bit of that before you try to tackle the big stuff, which is
one of the things, if you don't mind me stepping in here, Chris,
Oh, sure.
where I have seen success, especially managing with adults on conflict issues. And I think this, falls right into your collaborative logistics. And that is oftentimes when we get into conflict, what tends to occur, it's an issue, you're on one side of the table, I'm on the other side of the table, and I have a problem with Chris, Chris has a problem with Tony. And we're going back and forth because we have a problem with each other. Where we have seen success, and it is part of the leadership theory that, I've used within my schools, and also it is within our, where we do some conflict stuff within our courseware, is you oftentimes can look at conflict as an issue. And instead of us sitting on opposite sides of the table, Chris and I are sitting actually on the same side of the table, and the conflict or the issue is on the other side of the table. And both of us now are teaming together. We're collaborating to figure out how to resolve that problem that's sitting on the other side of the table. It is not easy to do when you have emotion and feelings that are energizing this. But when you start look pragmatically at the situation, if you can get that feeling of what is the conflict at hand, what is the issue, and putting the issue on the other side of the table, you'll oftentimes come to find out that when you team with the other person, you'll get to a lot of success where you both have ownership of the solution.
Christine, this reminds me I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me so much of what you write in that chapter about thinking about the way you have located people in space.
Yeah, we talk a lot about environment and position having an unseen amount of power in what happens in the conflict. And so we write several examples of how to think about that. Where are you? How are you positioning yourself for success in a conflict? Yeah, that's an excellent point, Tony.
Yeah, and where do you position I think Anthony or Tony, that's a perfect example. Do you position the conflict between two people across the table, or is it over there with two people working together? That's a great image.
Great. Well, I don't want to derail you guys, but I saw that collaborative logistics, and that seems to fall right in.
So I think it's just important here to say, you probably noticed that we spent 90+ amount of our time not even getting to the actual conversation of solving a conflict. That's true in the book. That's true in the moment. There's so much more that happens outside the actual part where we talk about it. But that is the last step. After you've done all of this work on yourself together, you're really setting the groundwork in your program for successful conflict resolution. There is an actual conversation with some actual steps. And a key component of that is looping. And Chris is going to talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, one of the things that we learned when we looked at our research on participants, we started using polls and things like that. We discovered that actually people were having a really hard time listening. Maybe you've had this experience in the last 12 months, right? People are talking at each other instead of with each other. And we also realized that if only one person could start sort of the conversation rolling in the direction of listening, then you actually could set the tone. You could lead your way out of the conflict. And it's actually quite magical. Looping has lots of names. We came up with the phrase looping from some other books and sort of made it our own. And the first step of looping is open-ended questions. So what happened? What does it look like from you? The second is restating. And sometimes people say summarize. We like to restate. I want to show Christine that I heard the words that she used. And then finally, and most importantly, we spend a lot of time on the difference between agreement and acknowledgement. Tony and I probably aren't going to agree if we're in a conflict, but I can acknowledge Tony's perspective. And that's really what Tony wants. He wants the eye contact, to go back to Christine. He wants to be heard and to feel like his position is legitimate. Now, of course, there are some conflicts where you need to agree and make decisions about steps. But for the most part, you can get there most quickly by looping with those open-ended questions, restating, and then making sure you acknowledge the legitimacy of somebody else's point, which, by the way, is exactly what you want from them.
Awesome. Well, great. And folks, we've run out of time. To be honest with you, we didn't expect to get here that quick, but I'll tell you, some fantastic discussion. And I could see how your book is so important. And do you mind if we just jump right to it? Can you guys tell us just a little bit about your book? Because since we ran out of time, I do, maybe at some point in the future, we'll have the two of you back because I think it's really interesting conversation. But tell us a little bit about the book that you guys have published as well. It looks like you're giving a nice little discount to everybody if they're interested in picking it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tony. I can speak for both of us, I think, when we say we'd love to come back. We could talk about this stuff literally all day, every day, and we do spend a lot of days talking about it. But the book is really designed to be used individually with a group, with a team of staff at a school, and really to explore these topics. There's some really helpful practice activities. There's a free book study guide on the website. We've done some blog posting with our publisher. So on the screen, you can see here that if you've joined today, you can use the code CONFLICT on the publisher's website, which is Free Spirit, and you get 25% off the book. You can also see mine and Chris's contact information here if you would, if you have questions, you want to talk further. We have a Facebook page where you can follow us, and the link to the blog post down there for Free Spirit's blog, you can find that on freespiritpublishingblog.com. They provide multiple resources in the social emotional content area for educators, and we periodically show up on that blog. Anything else you want to say, Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to say Free Spirit's been great about encouraging us to provide additional free content like professional learning community documents, which is really great. I have an employee going through that now. I just posted an essay about looping a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of content that connects back to the book. And we tried to make the book, well, exemplify those attitudes, you know, try to be self-effacing humor, try to be curious. We did do a lot of research. We try to bring it down to the level of all sorts of folks with lots of good diagrams and stuff. And as Tony mentioned, we would love to come back. I also would say we're happy to answer questions on the Facebook page or via email or Twitter.
Yeah, and thank you both, and thank you all for all the participants who've come today.
Yeah.
This has been a great topic, finding your way through conflict. I could see that if we did have you folks come back, maybe we'll narrow in on some issues. And where the issues come from are from our participants. If you want to give us feedback, whether you give it directly to Chris or Christine on their Facebook page, whether you come to us and say, hey, listen, I'd really love to dig into something a little more meaty. We're always into trying to figure that out in a few months for sure. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Chris and Christine for joining us today and being our speakers with a very relevant topic. Couldn't be more relevant today than ever, and also some very insightful thoughts, ideas about attitudes, about how to look at another person, about how to understand where the values of your organization are, how they build into your culture, and also how you're able to use tools like the last three that we spoke of on how to manage through those difficult and challenging times. We have faith in you all, but we'd like to thank you all for joining up and showing up here today. So until our next pop-up executive webinar series, this is Tony D'Agostino with Inspire Care 360 saying thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you folks for joining us today. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Tony.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.